When Curtis Metcalf thought back on his relationship with Edwin Alva, it was clear to him that he had been used from the beginning. Alva's recent betrayal wasn't a new development in his life. It had been simmering in the background ever since he first took Curtis in. In fact, he can remember the first time that he saw Alva's facade slip. It was years ago, when Alva Industries was still SA Industries, named for its founders, Asher Sim and Edwin Alva. The pair had developed a piece of code, an algorithm, that was the source of everything that SA Industries had done to that point. But Alva had done something to change it, without consulting Sim and going against a promise that they shared to never leave the other one out of development. This was going to get people hurt somehow, Asher argued, and Asher found that unacceptable. Alva pretended not to know what Sim was talking about, and then had him forcibly removed from the business. Curtis can see now that while Sim thought that he and Alva were friends and business partners, Alva never thought of him that way. He had used Asher Sims for his mind, and when he had to be removed, Alva shifted all of his attention on Curtis. He was never Alva's protege or heir apparent. He was a backup plan, a replacement cog for the removed cog that was Asher Sim. Curtis had thought that this fight was just between him and Alva, but now he sees that it reaches back to Asher too. He already feels guilty about getting his own protege, Tiffany Evans, involved in all this mess, but he can't focus on that right now. He needs to fix this first. Thankfully, he's Curtis Metcalf. He can fix anything. Well, I can break down anything. My name is Ben, and this is Comic Book Breakdown episode 22.4, The Enemy of My Enemy. Author Brandon Thomas opens us up in a flashback, much like he did with issue 1. That issue made sure to establish the idea that black people have a history of being mistreated in the United States, displayed at the time by the unjustified murder of a young black man, followed up with the attack on the protest that we saw in Milestone Returns, and finally ending with the direct connection to Curtis's own situation. Blamed by Alva Industries, hunted by the police and the FBI, and smeared by media outlets, Curtis has had to drop out of sight. This opening establishes that Alva's behavior regarding Curtis isn't anything new, and that Curtis made excuses for him in the same manner that he did his biological father. But, just like he didn't want to believe that his dad would someday leave them, he didn't want to see Alva's behavior in a negative light either. Curtis had already been abandoned by his father, which made him hungry for Alva's attention and approval. If he said that Sim was blowing things out of proportion, or that he didn't know what Sim was ranting about, well, Curtis wanted to believe that. As an audience member, our distance from both Curtis and Alva makes the betrayal seem kind of obvious and plain-faced, right? We have no emotional connection in this. But for Curtis, who found a surrogate father in Edwin Alva, a man who encouraged his mind and gave him access to resources and an education that he might never have gotten otherwise, Alva was very much like a hero. For a modern contemporary audience, this is the same thing as Peter Parker and Tony Stark in the modern MCU movies. It is easy to make excuses for a person like that, and it really hits home how emotionally painful this whole experience must be for Curtis. It also establishes the lifeline that Curtis is going to be reaching for in this issue, a man that he hopes is a kindred spirit, Asher Sim. This move should spare any innocents from their violence, like young Deacon, the child who was hurt last issue, or Tiffany Evans, Curtis's protege and lover. We then transition to Tiffany. Beautiful, by the way, I'm going to interrupt my own sentence and my own script just to say this is a beautiful transition, and I really like the way these flashback sequences transition into the real time. I'm going to be complaining a lot about Brandon Thomas smash cutting between scenes at the same time, or different time periods, or two different locations, and making this story not incomprehensible, but really rough to understand. But then you have moments like this, where you clearly see Curtis's thought process take us through several different time periods and lead us to a character and a place and time that makes sense, and it's perfect, and it's an amazing transition, and it's clear to me that Thomas knows how to write. He's choosing to use smash cuts for a reason. I just don't like that reason, I think, and it's hard for me to grapple with. But A plus job. Golf clap on this transition. So we then transition to Tiffany as she is released from jail. The first thing that she does when she's given her effects is, of course, she checks her phone for any messages from Curtis. But there isn't one. At least, not digitally. Instead, Professor Baraki Young is there to pick her up. You can see Tiffany freeze for a second upon seeing her. There's definitely a coldness between the two women. They get into Baraki's car and are silent for a moment. As they start to talk, it's clear that Curtis being their connection is incredibly awkward. Baraki is his old girlfriend, and Tiffany is the new. Baraki even comments that she knows about Tiffany and Curtis. She knows when they started, how they're doing, and yeah, she even knows how it's going to end. None of which is what she's here for, though. But she does need to get the air clear between them. Both of them know that Curtis is hardware and that Alva framed him, and that cannot stand. So, here's what they're going to do. And Thomas cuts us away, leaving us in suspense. Nice use of smash cut. This is a very short scene, but I really like it. Baraki had already shown a legal interest in Tiffany's situation last issue when Curtis went to see her, so it's cool to see that getting followed up on here. I like that neither of the women are going to take this situation lying down, nor are they going to wait for Curtis to clean this mess up on his own. They are going to do whatever they can because Alva needs to be punished and stopped. And sure, he has hurt someone close to both of them. That is what's getting them into this situation. But their job here is not to service Curtis's story. In fact, he specifically told Baraki to stay out of this. And yet here she is. Anyway, I think, and this is a big think, that Curtis and Baraki used to be a couple. That isn't the big thing. That's definitely implied in the shared dialogue. But at some point in their relationship, I think that Curtis either left Baraki or cheated on her with Tiffany. There's a really evident coldness and distance between Curtis and Baraki when they talk to or about each other in their previous scene. Additionally, when Baraki meets with Tiffany in this scene, Tiffany specifically addresses her as Professor Young. Not Baraki. Even after she tells the girl to use her first name, she still calls her Professor Young. Tiffany is trying to be respectful here, and it feels to me like she is trying to be respectful because she knows that she hurt her by engaging in a relationship with Curtis. That's some good drama. And it's all very carefully written, and I could be absolutely wrong in my reading of their dialogue, but I think that it makes sense. The tension between them is great, as they're both Curtis's best hope for clearing his name while he's on the run, but they also have every reason to dislike one another. It's a sign of character that the two of them are just like, hey, someone we know was hurt, and we can't let that stand. So let's kick some ass here and just be adults about all of this. I love it. So let's finish the other end of that smash cut. We are now at Alva Industries, who is yelling at a man named Veers, who we've never seen before, who appears to have lost track of Curtis Metcalf. It's been 11 days since Hardware flew into Alva's office and threatened him, Edwin Alva. And he wants answers and justice. Veers tells us what they've seen over that 11 days. They did have a hit at a hidden lab, but it was just some bang baby. See Static Issue 2/3 for more details. They did have a report in Brazil and another in Ethiopia. They suspect that Metcalf is upgrading his suit as he travels in places where his skin tone would be less suspicious. That has hampered their work in finding him considerably. Curtis Metcalf is a man of intent, Alva says. He is going somewhere to accomplish something. So stop chasing him and figure out where he's going. He's going to Singapore, which is where he picks up the Hardware armor and calls Asher Sim. Sim is not surprised by what Alva has done to Curtis, but he does believe that Curtis is innocent. He invites him to his facility, and we see Curtis fly off. In a small touch that I really like, Curtis tells Pop to play his Get Hype playlist on shuffle. I love having music play when I work, so I really feel this in my soul. If I had a suit of armor, it would definitely be loaded with my music library. For Curtis, this moment is where he is going to stop running and start preparing to fight back. So it's definitely a moment to get hyped in. Hardware flies around Singapore for a little bit, taking in the sights of the city and enjoying the night. He has Pop take pictures as he jams to his tunes. Eventually, he arrives at Sim Science and walks in. A hovering drone greets him, welcomes him, and scans him for any weapons. Pop deploys some form of countermeasure, which allows them to pass the scan while still being armed to the teeth. The drone escorts Curtis to a lab where he is left by himself for a minute. Pop says his name, just enough to warn him, but don't worry, Pop, he already knows. From behind, a robot attacks Curtis. Several robots, actually. Curtis notes that Sim is the best robotic designer in the world, so this isn't that big of a surprise. He fights the robots off, displaying more technology and weapons than we saw before, including a powered-up plasma fist, which I'm guessing gives him greater punching ability, an Omni cannon that fires concentrated plasma from his hand, and chaff grenades that can deploy from his back. The biggest point of this scene is to add some action into the comic. With Curtis on the opposite side of the globe from Alva, we're probably not going to see a lot of fighting for an issue or two. That means that Thomas needs to work some action into the comic somehow, and so we punch some robots. But this scene also serves to demonstrate the upgrades that Curtis has made to the armor. And it also displays Asher Sim's skills. Because while Curtis does manage to defeat all of the robots, they do put up a pretty good fight and force him to think creatively. They are a challenge to him, and that shows us that Sim's robots are better than what we have in the real world. Maybe they're not on the level of something like Star Wars' droids, or Bubblegum Crisis' boomers, or the replicants of Blade Runner. Remember, Milestone is establishing a new world here for us to read and exist in. We need to see the limits of the world in order to contextualize whether or not somebody like Hardware is exceptional, or is he just another dude in a suit, one of 10? In the same way we need that for Hardware, we need that for Sim too. Sure, he can build robots, but are they Terminator level indestructible? Are they Ultrons? Or are they just knock them over and they can't get up? So this scene does set an important bit of background information for us. Sim reveals himself and apologizes for attacking Curtis. He wanted to see how his robots would fare. And yeah, he also wanted to see how Curtis's suit would perform. He is a tech nerd. Sim looks like he could be in his 30s to 50s. We've got that Cowan Sienkiewicz age weirdness with thin black hair. I'm not sure if he's from Singapore or not, but he does appear to be Asian. He wears a nice black suit with a blue button-up underneath. He sits in a golden hover chair, evoking Professor X from 90s era X-Men comics for me. I love it. Curtis apologizes that he did not know about the loss of his legs, and Sim says that not many people do. That's intentional. While he knows that he shouldn't be ashamed of it, Sim has learned in his older age that he cares greatly for how others view him, and so he has protected his image from the world. He leads Curtis through a tunnel, which takes them underwater. The tube is made of glass, allowing the travelers an unobstructed view of the ocean around them. Bright corals, dozens of fish, and even a few sharks are easily visible. Curtis's eyes go wide at the sight. "Do you disapprove?" Sim asks. "I could always tell when you did." Curtis nods. Well, yeah. The Asher Sim that he knew would never go for something this cool. No offense. Nope, no offense taken, Sim replies. You're right. He wouldn't have. Curtis says that he came here because, in his mind, they're all the same people. Him, Alva, Sim. There might have been some changes over the years, sure, but at their core, they're still the same. Seeing something like this display, he worries that the old Asher Sim might be gone. Sim laughs at this. The Asher Sim who hates his old partner, you mean? Don't worry. They pass through a door and enter Sim's personal lab. Not everything has changed, he says. Sim adds that Curtis has free use of the lab for as long as he needs. Curtis pulls off his helmet, relieved. He's made do with what he could find on this trip, but this is the first real lab that he has gotten access to since fleeing Dakota. It is exactly what he needs, and he is looking forward to this. Great, Sim says. I'll leave you to it then. He excuses himself, needing to take care of some work in his public office. If Curtis needs anything, just let him know. Curtis nods. Cool. Just like the old days. In Sim's office, he's sitting in quiet frustration. His secretary calls him again. Sir? Should she put the call through, or... Angrily, maybe kicking himself on the inside, Sim does take the call. Unshockingly for us, it is from Edwin Alva. His inside man in Sim Science has told him that a certain suit filled with Alva Industries' intellectual property showed up at his door last night. How about that? Sim assures him that his man is wrong and retracts his statement, implying that this spy has been found and removed. Oh, okay, so I just have the wrong impression then, Alva says. Fair enough. What if I told you that the source code was back on the table? Sim has a hard time believing Alva on that. He remembers him saying, quote, that there is no world in which I will ever give it to you, end quote. Asher, that's the past, Alva says, and we are talking about the future. Things change, often when we least expect them. Just give him to me. There's a pause on Asher's end. How long do I have to consider this offer? 48 hours, Alva says. And then I'm going to take him, Asher. And you get nothing. I remember being annoyed by this setup when I first read this issue. It's so telegraphed that the one person that Curtis could turn to then turns on him. It's just so cliched and it feels so unimaginative. But reading this a second time, and especially reading all of it in one sitting, I have to admit that the scene feels right. We've had 3 issues up to this point, including the Milestone Returns one-shot, because it is in continuity, and they have hit us over the head with how influential Edwin Alva is. We have seen him order around the FBI, use the Dakota police to enforce his own agenda, and push his own narrative on the news. It makes complete sense that he would be able to reach Asher Sim, and even more sense when you think about the kind of person that Alva has been shown to be. Yeah, sure, he might have had Sim removed from his company, but clearly Alva has been spying on him since then. I would absolutely expect Alva to have been engaged in corporate warfare all this time over all these years. If he was useful enough to be used in building Alva's own empire, then I suspect he would think that Sim would be a dangerous threat on his own given time, and that threat would need to be managed. It isn't said outright, but I do believe that it is highly hinted that the accident that caused Asher's paralysis was due to Alva's influence. Asher also serves as a good complement to Curtis. Right now, Curtis is reliving what Asher has already gone through. Betrayed by his friend, stripped of his resources, forced with rebuilding his life. Can he find the strength of will to fight on? Or will he be beaten like Asher was? Or, maybe, can Curtis's example inspire Asher to metaphorically stand up and fight back once more? Just a quick aside, Thomas continues to use his extreme smash cut method of transitioning between scenes, but this time around, there are location boxes for many of them. So, thank you, either Brandon Thomas or editorial team, for including location names. That makes the movement from one scene to the other so much smoother. Much obliged. So you would think that issue 4 would open with Curtis, given that he is upgrading his suit with a clock ticking over his shoulder, which Curtis doesn't know, sure, but as the audience we know, and that is a classic literary device. But no, instead, we open at Medina University, which is where Professor Baraki Young teaches. And even then, we don't open with Baraki. Instead, we open with Tiffany Evans. She is sitting in an office, staring at her phone, reciting a speech to memory. 2 large men stand behind her. Right now, I would say that the context isn't very clear, but we will later learn that those dudes are bodyguards. Baraki shows up and tells Tiffany that it's time. As they walk down the hallway, she asks if Tiffany is scared. And she's hesitant to say it, but yes. Baraki nods. Good. Alva is not going to let this go unchallenged. There will be some kind of response. Is she ready for that? Is Curtis worth that? Tiffany stops for a second. And maybe he is. But Edwin Alva doesn't get to ruin the life of any brother and get away with it. Good, Baraki says. Let's tell him that together. Baraki and Tiffany then make a very public, very televised statement regarding Curtis's situation. Baraki goes first, laying the groundwork by saying that Curtis is innocent of the actions that he is allegedly being held responsible for. These are lies, being sold to the public by the Dakota Police Force and Alva Industries. Baraki encourages Edwin Alva to come forward and tell the truth, and in doing so clear the name of a brilliant scientist, an innocent man, and someone who once considered him a father. She then introduces Tiffany Evans, stating that she was held by Dakota police at the request of Edwin Alva himself, without any evidence of wrongdoing. Questions erupt from the cloud of reporters. Do they know where Metcalf is now? Do they have any proof of these claims? Does Metcalf have possession of a weapon of mass destruction? Did he assault the police? Baraki asks them all to calm down and hold their questions. Right now, Miss Evans deserves a chance to tell her story. She steps to the side, assuring Tiffany that she'll be right here. Tiffany looks into the crowd of faces and freezes. A world away, Curtis is watching the newsfeed while he does his work. You can do this, he says. Just take a breath. It takes her a second, but Tiffany starts off by saying that Edwin Alva is not the man that he wants the world to think he is. Curtis smiles and gets back to work. Good for you, he says. Asher Sim approaches as Curtis, panicked. What in the world are they doing? He has to stop them. Curtis assures him that he couldn't stop them even if he wanted to. He knows Baraki. Once she gets going, she doesn't stop unless she wants to stop. This is a good thing, Curtis argues, turning up public pressure on Alva. Let him be the one hounded by the media. At least, until Curtis is ready to face him again. Sim is hesitant to believe him, but he supposes that Curtis does have a point. He then adds that Curtis doesn't have to stay locked up in the lab the whole time that he's here. Sim does have other properties in the city. He could stretch his legs a bit, take a breath, it's okay. But Curtis is focused on the work. He wants to finish this as soon as possible. He's got to get back to it. Sim leaves him, returning to his office, and he calls Alva. Curtis thinks that he knows how bad Alva can get, that he's seen the worst of him. But he has no idea how bad you can be, does he? Watching the coverage of Tiffany in his car, Alva asks Sim to speed this up. How soon can he expect to have Metcalf back? And this is where Sim hesitates. This is a big decision. Alva doesn't appreciate how hard this is for him, and this is where Alva cuts him off. He was very clear with what he wants and how far he's going to go to get him. Don't make him come over there and get Curtis himself. He hangs up on Sim. Alva reaches his destination, which appears to be Alva Industries, and marches inside. The secretary calls for him, saying that the board is demanding to speak to him, and his only reply is a simple, powerful no. And he goes into his office. Alva opens a safe hidden behind a painting, which is a bad guy classic, I love it, and pulls out a black phone. He tells the voice on the other end that they are allowed to go as far as they did in the Mendoza affair. The voice is excited by this prospect. They'll contact him when they're finished. Alva closes the safe. What kind of man allows his women to fight his battles for him, he asks. He then looks at the video feed on his phone again. They're going to regret this day for the rest of their lives. They are going to curse the day that they met Curtis Metcalf. Alright, the scene with Baraki and Tiffany is a long-term story move. Obviously, this isn't something that we're going to see pay off now in this issue, but it does continue their story, and it explores a facet of this situation that Curtis can't, and adds another threat to this book. With Curtis relatively safe in Singapore, a world away, even with Alva pressuring Sim, the story still needs tension. So Thomas is shifting the immediate threat from Curtis to Baraki and Tiffany, by having Alva set loose whatever this threat is on them. They aren't protected by a suit of armor. They aren't squirreled away in a lab half the world away. They are right there in Dakota, Alva's home base, and he won't let this insult stand. I do not know who Alva called, but we will see them in action by the end of the issue, don't you worry. As time within our story counts down, news coverage of all kinds is listened to by Curtis and Asher. We learn that the Department of Justice has yet to release a statement on this whole affair, specifically meaning the Edwin Alva is a jerk portion of it. Curtis manages a brief call to Baraki on a secure line, congratulating her on their bravery. She responds that Tiffany is holding up well, you got a good one there, and we see her continuing to be interviewed. One news feed belittles the efforts of Tiffany and Baraki, writing them off as just Curtis's girlfriends, and bemoaning their use of the quote-unquote race card. Don't forget, that media outlet says, Metcalf is the one who assaulted police officers. That's not something that an innocent man does, is it? That bit of news coverage is all too real to my eyes and ears. We get down to 1 hour left on the deadline. Asher Sim calls someone in his office, saying, that thing they discussed before? They didn't have a choice. He then goes down to the lab to confront Curtis. Curtis isn't surprised by this turn of events. He did think better of Sim, but then he thought better of Alva too. He monologues, saying that he would have helped Alva even after the gas canisters thing. He would have helped him get through it. He would have helped Asher too, if he wanted it. He knows that Alva scares him. But Curtis isn't the child that he was when they first met. He stands up, and pieces of armor snap onto his body. He's beyond them now. Asher says that he won't turn Curtis over to Alva, but he can't risk his company and its employees anymore. He apologizes, and hits an app on his phone. Nothing happens. He hits the app again, and nothing happens. What? Asher doesn't understand. Curtis knows that he doesn't understand. This is what he's been saying this whole time. You don't understand me at all. He then unleashes an energy blast on the men that are flanking Sim, and we go into fight mode. Sim shouts for his men to be careful. He doesn't want Curtis hurt. Hardware starts off with an impressive display, ending by smashing and disabling Sim's hover chair. Don't worry, he didn't hurt Sim's legs. He wouldn't do something like that. But he has no such feeling towards Sim's men. Sim tells them all to stand down. This was a mistake. Clearly, this was a terrible mistake. Curtis then explains that it only takes 12 hours on a non-stop flight to get from Dakota to Singapore. So why did he take 11 days to get here? He has been upgrading and updating his tech along the way. He might have left Dakota wearing a suit made from Alva Industries tech, but he didn't arrive in Singapore wearing that same suit, at least not on the inside. And the work that he had begun on his trip, he has finished here. Okay, that's great. Asher says, but it doesn't matter anymore. Curtis needs to get out of here. Alva gave him 48 hours to turn Curtis over, and that time ran out 15 minutes ago. This doesn't really faze Curtis. Asher, nothing has happened. Nothing is gonna happen. He knows that he and Alva have history, but Sim's chair lets out a tone. That's a warning from the Singapore Air Force. They've got incoming. What Curtis doesn't understand is that Alva used to develop technology for the military-industrial complex. He was good at it, and he liked it. So Curtis's suit had better be as good as he thinks it is, because 3 missiles are streaking towards the Sim Science building. Back in Dakota, Tiffany exits another interview, and her bodyguard falls in step with her. She appreciates his backup, but she's certain that they're taking this way too seriously. I mean, she knows Edwin Alva. The worst that he's going to do is sue her into oblivion. The bodyguard, politely, disagrees. They're a pair of beautiful, strong young women who just embarrassed a rich white man on national TV. There is no telling what he's going to do now. Miss Young said to take no chances with her, so he ain't taking any chances. A voice behind them congratulates the bodyguard on his smarts. You should really listen to him. Tiffany's eyes go wide. What the fuck?
No swearing.
The bodyguard draws his pistol and pushes Tiffany back. She needs to get to safety. The voice that spoke to them says that it's too late, and repeats it 4 times. It's too late for that. The bodyguard is shot as Tiffany runs back into the room, shouting for Baraki to get out, now! Baraki's bodyguard draws his own pistol and takes up position by the door. Don't worry, Miss Young. They've done this a dozen times. She has nothing to worry about. Outside, we see a dozen identical men rushing into the building.
Ready or not,
they shout. I have mixed feelings on how things went with Asher. I actually like him choosing to help neither side. Asher definitely hates Edwin Alva and what he's done. He doesn't take his deal, he's not going to turn Curtis over, but he does choose to kick Curtis out. Sim's reasons make perfect sense for his character. He fears Alva, he loves the company that he's built, and he doesn't want to see his employees hurt in the pursuit of Curtis. And let's face it, Asher doesn't really care for Curtis all that much. I mean, he doesn't hate Curtis, but he's not friends with him either. They're kindred spirits, but they haven't seen each other in years and mean almost nothing to one another. This also explains why Asher suggested that Curtis leave the facility earlier in the issue, which really threw me when I first read it. Maybe Asher was hoping to move Curtis to someplace else and set a trap there. Maybe he wanted to move him there and then just tell Alva that Curtis left. Oh gee, he left my facility, I don't know where he went. That would be a very clever, sneaky move that I would approve of. However, Curtis shot him down, closing down that path entirely by neglecting to change locations. Then we have the fact that Asher just waits Alva's threat out. He does make that weird phone call, but I don't know who that call was to or why he made it. It feels like the point of that scene is setting up Asher's betrayal of Curtis, but how it's supposed to pay off, I can't tell. It doesn't feel like Sim is the one calling Alva. Like, it definitely feels like Sim called somebody else, but that's also the only person that we've seen him call and interact with. I honestly have no idea what this scene is supposed to be. It's a huge question mark for me. Similarly, after the fight scene between his forces and Hardware, we then have the reveal of how Curtis has been spending his time. This scene is written as if Curtis is making a big reveal, telling the audience how he's been upgrading his armor as he travels the world, and how that's a big, clever thing to do. But we know that. We had Mr. Veers tell us that last issue. It's not some genius move, my man. I mean, it is a smart move. I actually do applaud the idea that Curtis stealth traveled the globe, upgrading his armor and hiding in other populations prevalent with black people. But watching a magician, in this case Arthur Thomas, do the same trick twice takes the glory out of it, takes the magic out of it. This moment feels like time wasting. Precious pages that could have been used during the fight scene, to be quite honest, because that fight scene between Hardware and Sim's security forces is really bad. When Asher first shows up to talk to Curtis, he is shown alone. We do not see the crowd of security guards until the final moment before the fight happens, and they are even barely visible in the background of a panel that is focusing on Hardware's hand. I didn't even know they were there at first glance. It's like they just materialized from nothing. And I can't help but wonder, given that we've seen Asher deploy combat robots before, why didn't he do that again now? Did he only have the 4 that he sicked on Hardware in the last issue? Wouldn't it make more sense to have tested Curtis last issue, which is what we were shown? Sim straight up says he was testing his robots, but then use the intervening time between then and now to improve upon those robots, and then unleash them here. Demonstrate to me that Asher Sim is as much of a technological genius as Curtis keeps telling us that he is. And maybe that would have taken more guts than Sim has. I also wouldn't have minded if he had planned to wait out Alva's clock anyway, him just telling Curtis about the threat and the clock, and maybe they could have prepared a response together. These two men are supposed to be the technological masterminds in this triangle between Alva, Curtis, and Asher, and if 2 of them teamed up against the third, you think that would be really good, right? Why not ally? And obviously the reason you don't ally is because Asher at his core is a coward, where Curtis at his core is brave and wants to take the fight to him, and you could do that, and Asher sitting this out without making a decision makes sense for someone who is scared. But crap, is it a boring bit of storytelling. The ending cliffhanger for the issue is great. I love that, much like Curtis, Tiffany doesn't really seem to understand how far Alva is willing to go in order to get what he wants. I have been wanting somebody to fear that Alva would sue them, because that is absolutely the kind of response that Tiffany would be facing in the real world. You would be getting slapped with anti-defamation cases all over the place. We don't have superpowered assassins in the real world, but god dang do we have legal teams that want to kill you. I also really like the bodyguard here. I love his appreciation for Baraki and Tiffany's strength, and his open frankness with her. It's a little bit of fun and character from a very unsuspecting source in this issue, and it makes his death all that much more sadder. Rest in peace, cool bodyguard. Your time with us was too short. I'm not going to comment too much on the threat that Baraki and Tiffany are facing here, because we don't really get to see much of one. We're going to see more of him in the next issue, so I'm afraid you're going to have to hold on to that one. We've got missiles dropping in on us and an army of identical dudes coming at us, and unfortunately, that's just where we're going to cut it this time. Next time, it's probably a safe bet that Hardware does something about those missiles. Otherwise, that 6th issue of this comic is going to need a new lead character. So expect something along those lines, and once that's over with, Curtis heads back to Dakota. He's got a name to clear and a villain to take down. We will also learn more about the threat facing Baraki and Tiffany, and see how they handle a super-powered danger all their own. Join me in a week for Comic Book Breakdown episode 22.5, Self-Made Men.
Everyone, there are a million podcasts vying for your time and attention, and I'd like to thank you for listening to mine. If you would like to get in touch with me to share a concern, request a series, compliment me, berate me, whatever you like, send me an email at cbbreakdown@gmail.com. Otherwise, thanks for listening.